It's cannabis now, you know, go to your doctor, you can get it, and you can't. It's not so simple. So we haven't had heaps, but we've had a handful of people who reckon their children have changed after being immunised. And it might only be a very few, I'm not sure. But some people are saying certain epilepsy, like Dravet's, is very much coming from immunisation. And it's a tricky area for Carol to talk about, because the government just about, you know, ready to not let you go to school anymore if you don't get immunised. I just wondered if you've heard anything, does it come up in your world? Because we're at the extreme end of that, and you know, it's a very touchy subject, isn't it?
I've recently watched the DVD Vaxxed, and wow, scary, powerful stuff. I don't know whether any of you have seen it, but yeah, some of you have. Gee, it sounds like real information, doesn't it, coming from inside through a whistleblower that I was talking to Lisa about it the other day and saying, wow, you know, too much coincidence for all of these families with all of these kids who are progressing really, really well, you know, at around 1 year of age. And if they actually had the triple vaccine, things just went backwards and backwards fast, and they were diagnosed basically on the autism spectrum. I haven't heard it in epilepsy, and I'm just going to have a look at Lisa. Have we heard anything that may be vaccine and epilepsy related? So I guess the jury's still out, but one of the leading paediatric neurologists in the country, Ingrid Sheffer from Melbourne, is saying could be coincidental because at the time you have your vaccine.
Who said she's leading, Carol? She's leading against the ruin.
Okay, point taken, Andrew. Point taken. But their thinking is that it might be coincidental because it's happening at the 12-month period, or might be a trigger, from what I was understanding there. That yeah, so you've got genetics of epilepsy sort of coming along then at that particular point in time. Yeah, so don't know, Michael, don't know. But certainly I was very personally moved by the Vaxxed.
The Vaxxed movie is really interesting. We've got some in the hemp embassy now, and it's not saying don't immunise, it's talking about, it's a whistleblower from the pharmaceutical industry saying how they can manipulate stuff, which I don't think anyone's going to be that surprised by. And I think single-shot vaccines are probably much safer than the triple one. But anyway, we're going to learn first there's a lot of money to be made out of vaccinations, you know. From what I can see, people will pay you a fortune to take away their pain, and they'll pay you a fortune if you think you can stop it from happening.
And the vaccines, I didn't know this, don't need to go through the same rigorous testing and trials that normal medicines do. So it's being shot into the arms of our kids without that same rigour that's around all medications, including cannabis.
Well, I won't Carol up, but she's going to be here all day, and people can come and talk to you, and maybe we'll have a panel later talking more about epilepsy, depending on what happens. And really appreciate you coming up here, and you know, we're just trying to break that mould where nimbin's unacceptable, so now they're going to be talking in camera, you know, our committee member, she's not a nimbin. See if she looks alright still. Thanks heaps for coming. So there's quite a few speakers, and I hadn't really nailed down the order, and I wasn't 100% sure Dr. Andrew Katelaris would come. But do you want to come and talk for a little bit now, Andrew? Andrew, very controversial, this doctor. And I'm a big fan because he's been, you know, I think he's probably come to nearly every Mardi Gras in 25 years. And particularly on epilepsy, been totally groundbreaking and guaranteed to upset a few people and pretty furious. really appreciate his amazing work. He's not called Dr. Pot in Australia for nothing. Well, I don't think you like that title. You don't mind? Yeah,
Is Sista here?
No, I get it.
All right. Listen, just before just before the photos get here, and I talk about the core thing, I'll just say a few words about immunisation and epilepsy, I suppose you'd call it that. The point Carol made is very pertinent. The immunisation process has been categorised as a public health measure, and as such it doesn't have to go through the same rigorous testing as other pharmaceutical drugs. So my answer to people to say immunisation is safe, just as an intrinsic motherhood statement, I said, well, I'd like to believe that. Can I see your negative controls? And you'll find there's never been a negative safety control for immunisations at all. And that's a real worry. There's enough people that would cheerfully opt out of the process and follow natural methods of enhancing health of their children that we could form 10,000 people for a negative control and run it for 10 years and look at the incidence of autism at the end of that time. Now, it is true that a lot of children that are, well, no, that's the wrong way to put it. After immunisation, there follows a range of adverse events. I don't think anyone can dispute that. From a simple febrile illness to a local reaction at the site of the immunisation to a much more serious regression syndrome. Now,
I have to interrupt you, I'm really sorry, I forgot to, there's some people park their cars out here, they had to move right at the wrong spot, just outside. The toilets are there, there's a ramp there, and there's some people who park their cars there and they asked me to move them. Anyway, sorry, I forgot to do that.
okay. Something like Dravet syndrome, now you're probably familiar with the word, if not the process. Dravet is a very heterogeneous condition that has something to do with what they call a sodium channel. A sodium channel is a complex protein structure that transverses the cell membrane as responsible for moving sodium and potassium in and out of the cells. Now in Dravet syndrome they talk about a mutation which is an SCN1A or an SCN8A, all these different sorts of mutations. But I've seen kids with Dravet syndrome that are basically written off with like the proverbial dozens of major seizures a day to someone also diagnosed with Dravet syndrome that has maybe 1 or 2 seizures a month. And it's really hard to tie this in if it's a genetically driven disease. The answer appears to be it depends where in this complex protein molecule the lesion takes place. As you know, DNA is a code for the proteins. Depending on how many proteins are out of order and how that affects what they call the tertiary folding of the proteins, you can have a little problem with your pump or a great big problem, and that reflects different intensity of the seizure disorder. It's not likely that the immunisation has an epigenetic effect of causing Dravet syndrome. So it does appear that people become clinically obvious to have Dravet syndrome, not immediately at birth, but as it develops as they go down the track. So there's probably an unmasking rather than a causal factor. But that's a very, very different issue than autism. Right? The link with autism, I think, is unavoidable. Right? And just to give you an idea, I've heard during this talk some painfully naive questions coming out of this audience. I mean, if you're still wondering about what happened with the Marijuana Transfer Tax Act in 1938, there's countless documentary videos indicating that it was a destruction of the industrial uses of hemp, especially the textile and other uses, and allowing a market opportunity for nylon, which was a driving force. The drug use of cannabis was really a side effect of the larger industrial use, although the 10,000 corrupt police that were running the alcohol prohibition were looking for another prohibited substance or a substance to prohibit, and that's the way it tied in. But that history is well known. We're just shrouded under a thick blanket of ignorance by the Murdoch press. And as Mr. Goebbels himself said, if you give me the control of the media, I can make a flock of sheep out of your population in no time. And this country is very clear proof of that. It's not a clapping matter, mate. It's a matter to be very, very disturbed about. Now, the link with autism, I think, is unavoidable. Now, I go back. Do you want to hear this? This is a bit off topic for epilepsy, but I think it's important. I go back to the work of a colleague of mine, Andrew Katelaris. Has anyone heard of Archie? Oh, good, his memory lingers on. He was a pioneer in the 60s, and he was a straight-as-they-come general practitioner that went out to Collarenebri and worked largely with marginalised Aboriginal populations out there in the western New South Wales plains. When he got there to the town of Collarenebri, he found that the infant mortality rate was 50%. Half the children died before their first birthday. And in his conventional sort of approach to these sort of diseases, he said, we really must increase the rate of immunisation. And he did that, and to his horror, he found that the death rate actually went up and not down. And he was about to give up the whole show, but luckily, he consulted with some of the old and probably non-existent group of people now, the wise old physician, right? The quiet, thinking, observing sort of scientist that takes things in and analyses them without the complex of politics and religion and everything else. It's another thing I'll take quibble with. I don't know what it means to be a Christian country. Right? More wars are being fought under this Hebrew God than any other in recorded history, so I really don't identify with this country being Christian. And until we root out the vestiges of that primitive Hebrew religion and start to move forward in a humanist way, I don't think we're going to make any progress at all. I really object to the Lord's Prayer being said over Parliament and courts at this stage, but I digress. Anyway, increased the rate of immunisation, death rate went up, what to do. He consulted with someone of wisdom, and he was advised if he supplemented the children, if he gave great attention to their nutrition, he may be able to have a very positive impact. And to cut a long story short, they supplemented especially the vitamin C, because in Western New South Wales, living on canned food and damper and things like that, there was almost a total lack of vitamin C in the diet. And the way they imagined it was the extra oxidative stress of the immunisations placed an oxidative stress, used up the antioxidants in these deprived little bodies, and they basically go into a shock-like state. Now, I experienced this firsthand. I was doing coronial postmortems at the Institute of Forensic Medicine, and we'd be presented with these angelic children, 12, 15 months old, dead. Not a mark on them, obviously well cared for, but dead. Right? The SIDS epidemic. And in their wisdom, the Department of Health got us to do 70 different pathological tests on these bodies. We swabbed every fluid in their body for viruses. We looked at all sorts of metabolic derangements. But when building on the work of Archie, I said, what about the vitamin C status? Why don't we test these bodies for vitamin C status and see if the ones that are suffering SIDS are at the very, very lowest level? Oh no, we don't think that's a very productive way to spend our time or money. So the study was never done. What Archie did, he supplemented these children, and in the space of 2 years, he got the death rate at Collarenebri down to zero. Zero, right? So that teaches us quite a bit. First thing is, immunisation can and has and will be associated with significant and even lethal adverse side effects if they're not countered by proper nutrition. Right? Unfortunately, the whole issue has become more complicated lately because the number of immunisations are increasing, and the only way around that is to remove the process of immunisation from the private sector, from the pharmaceutical companies, who have a vested interest in increasing the number. Now, in the United States, where they have the highest density of immunisation, the greatest number of injection, their health outcomes are significantly lower than places that have a much more targeted thing. Now, someone mentioned the triple antigen, the measles, mumps, rubella, and the very valid observation that a small number, but a very, very significant number of children regress into autism within a tight temporal association of receiving this. And for some time, single immunisations were available in New Zealand. But the companies have now stopped marketing single immunisations for the simple reason, without having those single ones, there's no, and making it compulsory to have the triple, there's no way you can even do an observational study to see if single age, leaving it to the second year instead of the first year, has a smaller rate of complications. To make matters worse, instead of separating them back into singles, they've actually added a fourth. So the nightmare continues. I think they put herpes zoster, chickenpox, onto the thing. So it's no longer a triple, it's now quadruple. And we can expect the number of complications to increase. My song has always been, you can't fix any part of anything without fixing the whole, right? So that's, everyone says, what can we do about this and what can we do about that? We really need a top-down revision, but I'll get on with my talk after that little thing. Is cannabis a miracle oil? Well, unfortunately, I've only got anecdotes to go on. And that is a horrible word, Carol, you agree? An anecdote is a second-hand rumour repeated by someone not directly involved in generating it, right? David would not say it was an anecdote. He brought Disha up here to Nimbin about 4.5 years ago, and my introduction to Disha was a distressed parent holding a seizing child near enough in status epilepticus. Hey, Sista? Next one, please. That was Disha's life, a wheelchair and continence aids, and the promise of an early death, right? The promise, the only thing the Sheffers and the epileptologist doctors could offer her was a swathe of dangerous medicines, managing the side effects, and then expecting an early death. Okay, there we go, class captain for last year. That's out of This is not isolated. This is not an isolated finding. It's a common finding. And some of the questions that came out of this group here gave me the impression you believe the government was a decent group of people and they really just needed education, right? I mean, without getting too mystical about it, I think they're a bunch of Satanist mongrels that appear determined to destroy the country and keep the world together. And listen, you can't sit there in front of a court of appeal with three of these members in their red ermines. I mean, they might try and look distinguished, but to me they look like a bunch of half-wits playing dress-ups for a devil's ball. Anyway, that's where we're up to at the moment. Next one, please, Sister. Okay, what did it take to change, and next one too, please, to take Disha from where she was to where she's going? A simple grow tent, some carefully selected cuttings, and a little bit of time. That's all it took, right? Disha, along with a lot of these children, would spend days, weeks, or even months per year in hospital. The cost of epilepsy, especially in that subgroup, that 30% of intractable epilepsy, is massive. It's measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I have a great deal of sympathy for the ambulance, the paramedics, the emergency staff, when they're confronted with these kids. There's nothing more upsetting for a practitioner to be confronted with a child in status that you can't really do much for in your current state of knowledge. Well, my answer to that, grow your knowledge. Don't be satisfied with what you're told if what you're told doesn't help. So, once you get these children under control, the benefits are not only to the child themselves, but to the family, to the community, to the budget of the country. It's a major political as well as a humanist thing. And that's what we have to get. This isn't only about compassion. This is about economics. This is about the use of our resources. And the problem will get more and more acute. Now, why have the medical doctors, the MBBSers, and remember that's the degree you get when you finish medicine, you get an MBBS. Are you aware of that? Medical Bachelor of Surgery, an MBBS, and that's about the state of it. I don't want to cast myself as a doctor basher. About half the doctors I've dealt with in 30 years have been quality people, especially some of the surgeons, the paediatric surgeons, the orthopods. some of the endocrinologists, they work very hard and they operate on a fairly large knowledge base. So I don't have a problem with advanced technological medicine. I like endoscopy, I like virtual surgery. You know, some of the advanced imaging has made our life a lot easier in terms of practice. But what we're dealing with in that 10% of crud, and that's what they are, the politicised doctors that are running an agenda, and that agenda is control. Has anyone here read the book Witches, Midwives and Nurses, going back into the 60s? Any one person? No, that hurts me. That hurts me. It really outlines the takeover of the university-trained doctor against the witches, the midwives and the nurses. And it's really set the stage for the problems that we're having now. These doctors that are claiming not only the scientific but the moral high ground with their drugs because they've been tested, what have we learned lately? We've learned now that the SSRIs that have been in clinical practice now for 10 years can and do cause homicidal rage. And a lot of the mass shootings in the United States have been under deranged minds of people influenced by these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. We now learn that the anti-acid drugs are protein pump. So one problem with pot. The proton pump inhibitors, they now have all sorts of problems. They now have problems with causing Clostridium difficile. You have a greater risk of pneumonia. You have a reduced mortality. These are the drugs that have passed their safety test. And now I've been in this clown's game long enough to see their modus operandi. They introduce a new blockbuster drug and they clean up to the tune of $4 to $10 billion a year for 5 or 10 years until the side effects build up. And then it's sort of slid away into the shadows and a new blockbuster is put in their place. Even in the case of Vioxx, are you all familiar with Vioxx? Vioxx was a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory that wasn't going to cause stomach ulcers. And the advertising got it right. It didn't cause stomach ulcers when you took it for your bad knee or your hip or something like that. What it did, though, it caused heart attacks and strokes. And most people wouldn't trade a sore knee for a heart attack or a stroke. So Vioxx just got slid away and now another one's been put in its place. So we're not dealing with a very ethical group of people. Okay, Sista. So out of that 10, you get the bud. And that can make a difference in a child's life. That drying herb there can make a difference in a child's life, really between life and death. Now, at the beginning, Carol, I think, asked, does anyone know what epilepsy is? Well, I'll say this. For 20 years of hospital practice, I saw plenty of epileptic patients. I gave plenty of epileptic drugs. I didn't have the faintest idea what epilepsy was until I spent 24 hours with a family with a child with intractable epilepsy. That changed my view completely. It is a consuming condition that draws the whole family into a vortex of despair and desperation. Right? There's a big difference between book knowledge, knowing what the gene or even the epigenetics are, and actually knowing what the impact of that disease is on the family, and then what the impact of controlling that disease is on the family. And it really is, I said at the beginning, a miracle plant. It is a miracle plant, but at the moment now it's a miracle plant that's still in jail, and its full potential for the rejuvenation of humanity is not being met. Okay, next one please. Okay, how do we do it? I'm constantly asked how to make the best medicine. And the simple answer to that is start with a good herb. Right? If you start with a good herb, it's very hard to wreck it. But if you start with a bad herb, it's very hard to actually make it good. On balance, because of its unique safety profile, and I'm talking about a safety profile that's almost absolute. Almost absolute. It just doesn't compare to any other pharmaceutically active substance in the planet. And really, if I was to advocate home growing and home utilisation of drugs generally, the only one I could do with complete hand-on heart safety would be cannabis, because its potential for harm is almost zero. right? The potential for long-term harm is zero. Potential for short-term intoxication and immediate minor reactions, anxiety, tachycardia, a bit of hypertension. These sort of things are relatively minor. And we don't need a pharmaceutical model to try and take what is the safest and effective herbal medicine and make it into a pharmaceutical product for the betterment of pharmaceutical companies. Now, I think it was John Jickens that told me that the drug squad is the price maintenance unit of organised crime. And that's a very true statement. They keep the price up and organised crime collects the things. The TGA and its like affiliates are the price maintenance unit for Big Pharma, right? Someone mentioned the price of $100 a day for the legal cannabis. I don't know about that. On average, we can produce herbal cannabis for about $150 a month for most people. If we were growing on a large scale outdoors, we could set a price between $50 and $100 a month very, very easily. And if you're doing it in your backyard, that would come down to even less than that. The GW product is at least 10 times that price, so that's $1,500 a month for a product that works no better. Now, at the moment, we'll just talk about different production methods. We use this as Sonicator for a number of reasons. Firstly, it just looked good on TV, so you could take it to the ABC and it said, oh, this is what we're doing. It didn't show any rolling papers or bombs or anything like that. Because we've got to play the politics game here. We're faced with a constantly carping and harassing media. Carol's learned the sad truth. They cut and paste your answers. I've had that done more times now than I'm very comfortable with, where they'll ask you a question and then take an answer from a subsequent question, and you have no redress in this country. There is no redress. There's no point in going to various bodies and trying to get retractions or anything like that, because it simply won't happen. Okay, this form of sonication is very easy and easily standardised way to make medicines, and it works especially for young children where you don't need a high concentration of the cannabinoids. Right? For an adult to get, say, a useful dose from this method, you might have to take 15, 20 mils of oil, which is a lot and unnecessary. So this is suitable for small children on low doses. Next one, please. Okay, there's plenty of ways to make good cannabis medicine, and I'm not going to say here one way is better than any other. The way that works for you, the way that works for your circumstances, as long as it works for the child, is the way that it works. Here's another method that it's quite good, where you actually use the dry pollination method to gather the trichomes, and then you add weighed amounts of the trichomes into oil, and that can produce a very concentrated product suitable for oromucosal use. Okay, next one. The other way is everyone's familiar with the alcohol extraction, whether you're using ethanol or isopropyl acetone or any of the other hydrocarbon type solvents, and then they're very carefully vented in a 40 or 50 degrees and packed into syringes of resin. That's useful then, because a measured amount of resin can be added to an oil carrier of your choice in the concentrations of your choice. So you can make up a child's concentration or an adult's concentration at both high and low dose ranges. Okay. All right. There's a lot of things proliferating on the market now, and you really have to be able to read the labels carefully. Now, I'm not criticising this, I don't know anything about it, but when you say 250 milligrams of hemp extract, I know there's legal things going on here, but that's not a very big dose. And people have to become familiar with the difference between the concentration of a product and the volume of a product. We constantly get patients saying, oh, you know, I got 50 mils of oil from this guy and he only charged me $100, and this one charged $200 for 25 mils of oil, right? They have no idea of the concentrations. They can vary from as low as 1 milligram a mil up to 100 milligrams a mil. Some of the products from Canada, the Tilray product, which is coming in as part of the trials, at least it's being handed out in Victoria at the moment, has 100 milligrams in a mil, so it's a very concentrated product. Although I haven't seen the HPLC readout on that to actually know where the minor cannabinoids come in. Okay, so you do have to read the label carefully and try and work out what's going on. Okay, Endoca. there's a number of fairly standardised and fairly reliable oils are now making their appearance. So I'd say Endoga and Charlotte's Web, I've used them both now in childhood epilepsy, and I found they both work reasonably well. And as a rule now, when I'm confronted with a child with epilepsy, if it's an uncomplicated epilepsy, by that I mean it's not associated with a large degree of spasticity or major pain situations or something like that, I find it comfortable and easy to start all the children off. We want some sort of standardised algorithm on a high CBD oil because the majority of the kids will gain improvement from that. And even if you don't get total control of whatever syndrome they're suffering from, you do start the process of neuronal healing. It's an antioxidant, a major intraneuronal antioxidant. So wherever the CBD goes, benefit will go with it. Okay, next one. The key to us moving forward is to actually know what we're doing. Now, this movement has been bedevilled by political infighting, by backstabbing, by point scoring, by ego, and all the normal things that humans sort of carry around on their shoulders to make their brief journey through life a lot more difficult than it needs to be and a lot less productive. But to move forward with this, we really do need to take it to the next level. Now, we don't have 10 years to wait for a government to take action, let alone the children that we're dealing with. They don't have 10 years to wait. So if it's to be, it is up to us, basically. No point in waiting for the government. In West Australia, they couldn't find one medico to step up and start prescribing cannabis. My attitude is, why would we even engage with and talk to a profession that spent 70 years denigrating cannabis against all the science? I really only like to deal with scientists, and that's an open-minded person. Okay, what we got here is a TLC, or a thin layer chromatography. It's a very simple form of technology, and in fact it was the normal way of analysing cannabis in laboratories in the 1950s and 60s. And because of its ease of application and relatively brief learning, we use that to actually move things forward in the last 4 years. Now there, you can see 4 separate columns. Even though it's a simple test, you get quite a bit of information if it's done carefully. You put a spot, a standardised extracted spot of 4 samples, and you run them up through a solvent, then develop them with colours. It's as simple as that. Now, very simply, you can see there, this was one of the first TLC tests that I did. The spot at the top, on the second from the right, that's the CBD spot. Can you all see that? It stands out. Yeah. Right, as you can see there, there was very little CBD in any of the samples. Back as 2002, in those happy days when we still had access to proper university HPLC, I looked at 20 different specimens of cannabis, broadly chosen from the sort of the underground markets here, and we didn't find 1 milligram of CBD in any of them. We and others got this 1-to-1, a Z7 variety, came in from Spain. It was the first time we had actually had CBD in any of the mix. Okay, next one please. Oh no, before you do, the size of those spots indicates the amount. So it gives you 2 different readings. It gives you 3 readings. Firstly is how fresh it is. That the tail at the bottom is called the acid tail. That specimen, you can see about half of it's down there and half it's up there. As a rule of thumb, that gives you about half as decarboxylated and half as non-decarboxylated. The size and the amount of dye gives you an indication of the volume, and the location of the spots gives you an indication of what's there. And when they're done very carefully, you can break it down into the significant minor cannabinoids. Now let me just settle a few things. Everyone rattles on about these 100 cannabinoids. It's largely hot air. Right? There's half a dozen major players. The rest are in tiny amounts and often only transiently present as part of a biotransformation. So we don't have to get ourselves tied up in knots and spend decades working out what's best, when we know a good balanced cannabis works miracles in more than 2/3 of the patients that we're giving. Okay, next one please. Okay, that's similar, but as you can see, as we got better, we started to break out the different CBD variety by sort of reverse breeding, and increasing. You can see the one here, the 3-to-1 here, has more CBD than THC. Now, my experience with epilepsy is firstly, the final arbiter, no one knows until you do it for an individual child, and the individual variations are quite significant, and that can also change during the evolution of a child's life. Like what might have been very successful when they were an infant may not work if they're a menstruating young teenager or something like that. And you have to move through different stages of management. As a rule though, as I said, I like to start off the children with the highly dominant CBDs for a number of reasons, both political and practical. Firstly, they're available. When I say highly dominant CBD, I'm talking about a 20 or 25 to 1 like in Dover or Charlotte's Web. Very highly dominant, but not purged of THC, and none of us here buy into the THC is bad, CBD is good. It's a pathetic face saver by a bunch of scientific illiterates that can't face the fact that they've been lying to themselves as much as the country for the last 50 years. And it certainly is the combinations at work. But having said that, I've seen enough cases of a child that's been stabilised on a CBD dominant cannabis, and by CBD dominant, I really mean anything more than 50%, but it really starts to become CBD dominant at about 3 to 1, and certainly at 20 to 1. They can be well controlled, but as you add THC, a group of those will actually lose control, right? Further, when a child is first exposed to cannabis, and my first 12 children that I were actually dealing with had all received cannabis medicines before I got to them, and had all responded in a more or less favourable way, but they had all failed to respond down the track over a period of several months. And there was 2 different reasons for that. One of them was the quality of the product had deteriorated and there'd been some dilution. But there does seem to be a biochemical issue that too much THC, that's out of balance, you can actually lose control of the seizures. So I think, especially for people who are dealing on an N=1, their own child or their neighbour's child or something like that, it's safer to start with a highly CBD dominant and then add in THC. Now the issue of the acid versus the decarboxylated one has not been settled, but there are some very interesting indications that the THCA and the CBDA have overlapping but distinct beneficial qualities. In the first instance, because we didn't really know what we were doing when we first came out with the one-to-one, we tried to set it so it was half decarboxylated. So, I mean, I don't like sitting on a fence on issues, but sometimes when you're confronted with a lack of science, you have to make a decision, and we went for 50-50 and got fairly good results. It would be a simple matter down the track to actually run a trial, have a highly non-decarboxylated oil and a decarboxylated, and just run it on established patients. And in 2 or 3 weeks, you'll get a very clear indication from the parents as to which one's working and in what way. There is a suggestion that the THCA and the CBDA have an energising and an awakening effect, and there's probably some value in giving the raw cannabis during the day and the heated cannabis at night. That needs to be further explored. But it's a question of individual trial and error, basically. In the future, and I'll explain soon how we hope to get to the future, but in the future, a patient family would be provided with a sampler. Instead of sending out a bottle of oil and the hope that it'll work, they'd be given a sample. You'd have your CBDA at this end and your THC at this end, and 5 intermediates. And over a course, a very brief period of time, over a few weeks, you can rapidly see how the child responds and what their ideal medication is. It doesn't have to be complicated. Okay, next one, please. All right, the difference in qualities of the oil. Remember what I said, that the size of the blob reflects how much, how concentrated, how strong it is, and the location shows the different ones. Now there's 4 different types of oil here, and if we were talking to the government, they'd say they just refer to cannabis like it's a generic thing. All cannabis is the same. You try and compare that second from the right to the far left, and you tell me they're the same thing, right? You tell me they're going to have the same benefit. Hardly. look at this, we'll go through it one at a time. On the second from the right, that's just a very ordinary street THC cannabis. It's got very little in it apart from a modest amount of THC. You move over to the other one, you can see there's a fair bit of CBD, but it's still a fairly lean sort of mixture. Moving over to the ones on the left, you see the appearance of this block below the THC line. That's THCV, or cannabidivarin, and that's getting a lot of attention at the moment from the GW pharmaceuticals, who feel that it has a especially effective effect in cannabis refractory epilepsy. So these are areas of research that are worth progressing. What we found though is that THCV, or the cannabis that has the THCV in it, does give it a little extra bounce in almost everything we do, chronic pain and cancer management and things like that. Most patients confronted with cannabis with and without the THCV will go for the one containing in the long term. But I hope I'm making my point. Those 4 samples would be referred to by the government as cannabis. So when they say cannabis works for this or cannabis doesn't work for that, you really have to interpret it in the light of what we're dealing with. Okay, is that point made? We can move on. Okay, next one. All right, this is the next generation of testing. This is the HPLC. So instead of TLC, or thin layer chromatography, this is a high performance, a high pressure liquid chromatography. And this was actually run by the Pelican study. Now, it's just a lot easier to read, and you can get an exact numerical readout for the amount of the various cannabis there. But just to make my point about dominant cannabis and these also-rans, you can see the total amount of all the minor, or a few of the minor cannabinoids at the bottom really don't contribute in a major way to the overall effect. I'm not saying they don't have an important modulating effect, but let's just, when we're trying to get a basic approach, let's just keep it relatively simple. And the CBD, THC, THCV, CBN sort of things, the big half a dozen are the major ones to be concerned about. So there is just a fairly straightforward, and again you can see the raw on the left, the THCA, and the THC on the other side. So we'll say there's a more or less heavily THC dominant cannabis, which is about 2/3 raw. Okay, so you can read quite a lot into this. Next one please, Sista. Okay, here we have a much more balanced cannabis. This is the one, it came from the original Z7 from Spain, and it's very nearly a 1-to-1 THC to CBD. And we've found this to be a very useful workhorse of cannabis. It's a good one to start people on who may not have had any experience with, we're not talking only epilepsy in this instance, but people who've had no experience with cannabis, people that may approach the whole idea of taking cannabis with trepidation. And I mean, I know I'm in a town here where the biggest trepidation about cannabis is not being able to get it, but for a lot of people, they'll sit there and agonise over whether all those horrible stories I were told about men growing breasts or getting hair on the palms of your hands or something like that is true, before they dare to reach over for a drop of what really is the safest medicine in the world. Okay, next one. Oh, that doesn't add much. That's just a much more raw version. Okay. No, doesn't add much either. Okay, here's one. This is one I think we, I don't know where we got that one from. That was one of the American ones. The real problem here, this is a hemp variety with very low levels of THC and substantial levels of CBD. This makes it a very useful and inexpensive way for us to harvest what will probably be an ideal anti-epileptic medicine, all right? Relatively CBD dominant, but with a small sampling of THC. Unfortunately, the TGA, in their wisdom, are trying to enact legislation. I think Andrew Cav will actually give you more details about what they're trying to do. But at this stage, you can bring in CBD-containing oils for topical use. So Charlotte's Web and Endoga and others are coming in more or less legally. I think there's a bit of argy-bargy depending on the fanaticism of the customs officials. But at this stage, they can be brought in legally. My understanding is by October, they're trying to close that loophole and restrict even the amount of CBD in medicine. This is a massively retrograde step, and it's done without a scintilla of scientific validation. Luckily, there are a group forming now to take this to court and actually dispute the legality of imposing these restrictions. Okay, next one. Okay, this is a flowchart for what you're meant to do when you're confronted with a child in status epilepticus. Now, the reason I'm showing that there, have a look. Okay, you give benzos, they don't work, you give more benzos. If the kid's lucky enough to be still breathing, at the end of that, you have a choice. And the reason, whenever there's a choice in an emergency resuscitation, it's because neither work very well. If something worked efficiently, there would be no choice. Do it this way, it works. But here, depending on your choices, you can go one way, use this drug. It's really just rearranging the decks on the Titanic, but it gives you an idea of where the actual science is up to. Okay, Sista. All right, there's the scene of the crime. I'll just give you a quick update on what happened with our arrest. After Channel 7 did their little hatchet job on us concerning the child whose name I can't mention at the current time, we were raided by 12 police officers that turned up in their thug gear with their door hammers, ready to sort of smash the suburban door down. Luckily at that stage, that nice bag of weed there had already been processed, and the only thing that was taken was 11 kilos of already extracted herb. So it was no accident that we were arrested. We wanted to be arrested. We had enough leftover cannabis that we didn't actually lose anything to the movement. And now we're hoping to run the first proper medical necessity defence before a jury. Unfortunately, that's one. Yeah. We have every chance of winning this. And there's not only me, there's myself, there's BJ, there's Jenny Hallam, there's a couple of others all ready to run medical necessities. But I like to think our case has been prepared better and we can substantiate the evidence and present it in a whole better way. The only problem now I find, because of the number of arrests that have been made, it won't be within a year until we actually get our day in court, or as it's going to turn out, several weeks in court, because we're going to make these people squirm and suffer under a constant parade of transformed children. And if the jury finds anything other than not guilty, I'm out of this country, because I think there's not even 12 decent people left in this country, which I'd like to think there is. Next one, Sista. Okay, needed urgently, said the doctor. I think I said that 3 years ago. Right? So someone's idea of what's urgent and what's non-urgent, and really what we're dealing with here, right? And let's just take a really calm look at what we're dealing with here. We're dealing here with people that are quite content to sacrifice the lives of their children for the financial well-being of corporations. Right? Did you get that? You must know it. You have to actually feel that. They're happy to sacrifice children to their god of profit. Okay, next one. All right, there's a number of little groups that are forming. I think that's the support vehicle for the grannies for medical cannabis or something like that. The only way forward, right, is courage and action. It's often been said that a person's life begins to end the moment they're silent over something that they should be speaking up about. What is this stigma bullshit, right? The stigma is the fact that we've allowed ourselves to live under a government that can sacrifice our children for profit. That's the stigma that we should feel in our hearts, not the fact that we're advocating cannabis, which is the way out of this ridiculous situation. Okay, next one. All right, here's a shot. If you can't read that, overgrow the government. That is a harvest, I think, from 1998, 1999, when a busload of activists from this town came down to Corindi and helped us pull in one of the first legal cannabis crops that were ever planted in this country. Most people aren't aware we actually had a licence and a grow room for medical experimentation from 2000, 2001. But it was closed down when they realised we were running far too far in front of the action that they wanted, which is go slow and go nowhere. All right, I will just take 5 minutes to give you an update on what's happening in New South Wales as far as goes with family and community services. Now, has everyone seen what I put on the internet concerning the case of Walker Stephen? No. Okay. It turns out that New South Wales has the highest rate of child seizures in this country by a large margin, and one of the highest rates of government seizure of children in the world. Right now, from time to time, I've come across parents that tell me these terrible stories about how their child was seized, and I mean, in the years past, I thought there must have been more to it. Maybe they were drinking or this or that, and from time to time, parents do need to be dispossessed of the care of their children for the well-being and sake of the children. But over the last 12 months, I've come across too many cases where a child has been seized on totally spurious grounds. And the classic case is a case of Chase. Now, we first became involved with this 4-year-old boy in Queensland, where we had a frantic phone call saying that the Lady Salento Hospital had put an amber warning on this child, meaning it's been removed from hospital against medical advice, and the people who are removed it are considered to be kidnappers, notwithstanding that they were loving parents of this child. Anyway, we heard from these people a distress phone call, can you help us? They're after us. They're going to arrest us and take away our child. So we offered them political asylum at the clinic in Newcastle, and they came down, 2 well children, the afflicted child and the 2 parents. Unfortunately, because of the blanket publicity that had been put out as part of this Amber Alert, the mother was spotted in the street, and before we knew it, she was surrounded by 10 thuggish police who barricaded the street, and she was in the process of being arrested thuggishly by the time we got there. Now, luckily, in aggregate of the 10 police, we managed to get a functional IQ together, and we convinced them that they may not be in full possession of the facts. And over a period of 2 hours of talking myself hoarse, I managed to convince this cop that all wasn't as said. The parents hadn't kidnapped the child, they loved the child, its siblings were all over it in a loving way, right? And they started to feel that there were some cracks in the official story. So we negotiated whether we could take this child to a hospital and have it examined. And if an independent doctor formed the opinion that it was under no immediate threat to itself, it could go home at peace with its parents. We went under heavy police guard to John Hunter Hospital, and we were examined by an experienced paediatrician there. She spent an hour taking the history because she was aware